Consider this to be a blood vessel with two ends, A and B, and now I want a flow of blood in a general direction from A to B. Now to achieve this, I'm going to put a muscular pump in between. Let's say this is our muscular pump. Now in order to get a net movement of blood from A to B, this pump will do two things. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to contract, and when it contracts, the volume is reduced, thus the pressure is increased, and thus the blood has a pushing force, so the blood is pushed. The second thing it's going to do is it's going to relax, and when it relaxes, the volume increases, thus the pressure decreases, or you can say it creates a suctioning force, and the blood is sucked in. The problem with the way it is set up right now is that every time it contracts or relaxes, the movement of blood is towards both B and B, or when it relaxes and sucks the blood, it is going to be from both B and A. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place two valves at two strategic points. First one over here and the second one over here, and that creates a little chamber. Let's call it C, where the pump is. Now the property of these valves is that they are unidirectional. Let's call the one between A and C be valve A, and between C and B be valve B. Since I only want my flow of blood to be from A to B, the valve A is only going to allow blood to be moved in the direction of A to C. So VA is from A towards C. Similarly, VB is only going to allow the movement of blood from C to B. Thus, every time the chamber contracts, the volume is reduced and the blood feels a pushing pressure, and thus VA closes and VB opens. Similarly, when the chamber relaxes, the volume is increased and a suctioning pressure is created inside C, which is going to suck blood, but the only valve that is going to allow the blood to be sucked in is the valve A, so valve B will close and valve A will open. So the important point to note here is either it is contraction or relaxation. The first event that is going to happen is closure of a valve, into the valve that will not allow the movement of the blood during that phase. So in case of contraction, it is because we don't want the blood to move from C to A during contraction. So the valve that is going to close will be valve A, and during relaxation, since we do not want the blood to be sucked from B into C, so the valve that is going to close is valve B. Now let me draw it in a bit more anatomical fashion. Now let's say this is A, this is our chamber C, and this is B. A here being the left atrium, C is left ventricle, and B is your aorta. The valve between A and C, let's put it here, it is going to be the mitral valve, and the valve between C and B, let's place it over here, it is going to be the aortic valve. I'm going to write it as AV and MV for short. Now, as you already know, contraction is equal to pushing, and the other name for contraction is systole. We are talking about the ventricles, of course, especially the left ventricle over here, and the pushing is equivalent to ejection. But relaxation is equal to sucking of blood due to the suctioning force created by the ventricle, and relaxation, as you know it, is diastole, and suctioning is going to be filling of the ventricle. Now let's expand a little bit further on the same concept. So we have systole and we have the diastole. Now systole is contraction and as a consequence ejection of blood, and diastole is relaxation and thus suctioning of blood. The first event, as I already mentioned, is going to be the closure of the valve that is not going to allow the movement during that phase. So the first event that is going to happen during systole is the closure of the valve that will not allow the movement of blood from chamber, that is left ventricle, into the left atrium. So that is going to be closure of the mitral valve. Similarly, in diastole, because I want the blood to be sucked by the ventricle, or the ventricles need to be filled with blood, and the only direction that it should happen is from the atria to the ventricle. So the first thing that is going to happen during diastole is the closure of the aortic valve. Now once the closure of the respective valves happen during each of the period, the ventricle becomes an isolated volume and it either contracts or expands. Thus for a brief period of time the volume of the ventricle does not change, and this phase terminates by opening of the valve that is required for either ejection or filling of blood. So in systole, this phase will end after the opening of the aortic valve, and in diastole, because the blood has to be suctioned into the ventricle or the ventricle needs to be filled for the next cycle, the isolated volume of the left ventricle due to the closure of the aortic valve and that period is going to terminate by opening of the mitral valve. Now this period between the closure of mitral valve and opening of the aortic valve during the systole, or the closure of the aortic valve and opening of the mitral valve during diastole, since the volume is not going to change, it is also called the isovolumetric phase. And during systole, since the ventricles are contracting, so we call it isovolumetric contraction. And during diastole, since the ventricle is relaxing, we call it isovolumetric relaxation. So the first part of both systole and diastole is going to be an isovolumetric phase. After the opening of the aortic valve during the systole, the functional aspect of the systole is going to happen, and the functional aspect of systole is ejection of blood into the aorta. So the next phase is going to be the phase of ejection. Similarly, in diastole, after the opening of the mitral valve or the termination of the isovolumetric relaxation phase, the functional phase of diastole is going to happen, and the function of diastole is the suctioning of blood or the filling of blood. So we have the phase of filling. So the phase of ejection in systole has only two parts, very easy to remember. Initially the ejection is going to be really rapid, so we have the rapid ejection, and then we have the slow ejection. And to make it easier to remember or understand, during diastole we also have a rapid filling phase and a slow filling phase. Now the rapid filling phase is actually due to the suctioning pressure. However, during the slow filling phase, the left ventricle has already relaxed to an extent that it could usually. So the slow filling phase is actually just a passive filling phase because the mitral valve is open and there is blood in the left atrium. And this is the phase where the ventricular wall has the least amount of movement, so it is also called diastasis. Now, after the rapid filling and the slow filling phase, there is 70% of the filling that has already occurred, but there is still 30% of blood left in the left atrium. And since the left ventricle cannot relax anymore, so it cannot create a negative pressure anymore, So the last 30% of the blood left is going to be pushed into the ventricle by the force of contraction of the atria. So the last part of the ventricular diastole is going to be atrial systole. So now let's represent the same information in a linear form. So we have one line for the systole. So it begins with the closure of a valve, the valve that is not going to allow the blood to flow in the opposite direction, that is from the ventricle to the atria during systole. So that is the mitral valve. So at the beginning of the systole, the mitral valve closes, and V closes at this point. And in fact, this is what creates the first heart sound. So the closure of the mitral valve is the first heart sound. After the closure of the mitral valve, we know that the first part of both systole and diastole is going to be an isovolumetric phase. So here, since in systole the ventricles contract, so we have the isovolumetric contraction, and the termination of the isovolumetric contraction phase is by the opening of the valve that is going to allow flow of the blood during the systole, that is from the ventricle to the aorta, and that's going to be the atrial valve. So atrial valve opens, and this opening of the atrial valve does not produce the second heart sound. It is actually a very faint heart sound that we usually do not hear on the stethoscope unless there is a pathology, but this one has a name since it is followed by ejection, so we call it ejection click. And after the ejection click or the opening of the aortic valves, the ejection is going to happen. So initially the ejection is going to be rapid and then slow ejection, and that marks the termination of the systole. Similarly, we have the diastole. So the first event that is going to happen during the diastole is again the closure of the valve that is not going to allow the movement of the blood during relaxation or diastole. So that valve is going to be the aortic valve to prevent the backflow of blood from the atria into the left ventricle. So we have closure of aortic valve at this point, and this is what produces the second heart sound. And just like the ventricular systole, the first part of ventricular diastole is also an isovolumetric phase. Here we call it isovolumetric relaxation because that's what happens during diastole. And the termination of the isovolumetric relaxation phase is due to the opening of a valve, and the opening of a valve that is going to allow the flow of blood into the left ventricle so as to allow for filling. That valve is going to be the mitral valve. So here we have MV opens, and this again produces a very faint sound that we usually do not hear on a stethoscope, but in this case it is called an opening snap. And after that we have initially the rapid filling, then the slow filling of the diastasis, and in the end we have the atrial systole, because by the time the rapid filling phase ends, the left ventricle has lost most of its suctioning force, and so it depends upon diastasis, and at the end the 30% blood that is already left in the left atria, so the atria contract and they push blood into the ventricle, and that marks the end of the diastole. Now there is a little period between systole and diastole that is called the protodiastole. Some people categorize it as a part of diastole itself, but I'm just going to point it out here. It's a separate entity so as to create no confusion, and once the concepts are clear you can just remember it to be a part of the diastole. Well, protodiastole is basically just a small period of time when the ventricles stop contracting and the AV valves actually close. So it lies just at the end of the systole and the beginning of the diastole. So to summarize this video, I would like to mention a few points. The first point, that heart as a pump is going to contract and relax, and when it contracts, it's going to push blood and when it relaxes, it is going to suck blood, and only 30% of LV filling is active. That is due to the atrial systole at the end of the ventricular diastole. It's due to atrial systole. The second part is that the beginning of both systole and diastole is marked by closure of valves. These closure of valves is actually to isolate the volume of the ventricle and to create a buffer zone between systole and diastole. And so we have the closure of MV in systole and AV in diastole so as to prevent any retrograde flow. And this closure of the MV valve causes the first heart sound, and similarly the AV closure causes the second heart sound. The third point that I want you to remember is that the first part of either systole or diastole is an isovolumetric phase, and in systole, because heart contracts, is going to be isovolumetric contraction, and in diastole, since the heart relaxes, it is going to be isovolumetric relaxation, and this is followed by the functional aspect of both either the systole or the diastole, and in case of systole it's going to be ejection, and in diastole it's going to be filling. And don't forget about the opening of valves, and the opening of valves that marks the termination of the isovolumetric phase. During systole, it is the aortic valve that is going to open to allow the blood to be ejected into the aorta, so the AV opens. And during diastole, at the end of the isovolumetric relaxation phase, the mitral valve opens so as to allow for filling, and the AV valve opening causes because of ejection, it causes an ejection click, and the MV opening causes an opening snap. And that's the end of this video. Thank you very much.